So now let's draw together the features that we've learned and see how they can be used together for particular purposes. As we've seen in the previous videos, we have seen a number of features relating to opening a file, reading a file as a single string, reading a file as a list of strings where each string is a line, for looping over the file, where we get to look at each line in turn as a single string and then execute a block for each one of those lines. We've looked at strings and saw that we can split a string on a delimiter to get back a list of strings. We can join a list of strings back into a delimited file using the join method. We can slice a string by specifying the begin and end points of a string and return a new string based on that on those indices. We saw that we can strip a string by removing the new line from the end of the string. And we also saw that we can take a multi-line string and split it on the new line character to get back a list of strings. Finally, we looked at lists and saw that we can get individual items from a list to return just that item, or we can get the len of the list to see how many items are in the list. We'll look at sysarg at another time. So let's talk about bringing all those features together into a useful formula. What I'm going to show you now is something that allows us to summarize tabular data. And it's very simple, and yet it's got several lines together. Formula or algorithm. An algorithm is simply a series of statements that will, towards this particular purpose. It doesn't have to be very fancy. It doesn't have to be Google's search algorithm. It can just be any algorithm. Any algorithm can be any number of statements that, when combined together, serve a particular purpose. So now I'm going to bring together the different items that we've talked about and show you how we can take these different pieces and use them to summarize data. We begin by opening the file. Now, as you know, that gives us three options, and this is really the way you want to think. If I open the file, then I have three options. I can read the file as a single string. I can read lines the file as a list of strings, or I can loop through the file line by line and look at each string individually. And that's what I'm going to suggest we do right now. If we loop through the file line by line, each line is a string. So here we have what's called a file object. It's in quotes because it has a different name now in Python 3. We now have a string object, which is one line. And it being one line, that simply means that we're looking at one line from the file. And because this is a block statement, a looping block statement, we know that we're going to be able to loop over each line one after another, and during which time the block will be executed once for each line in the file. We then want to see how we can split the line so that we return a list of strings, right? So we know we have a list of strings here. The list of strings is the fields from the line. And I've shown you illustrations of that previously using a specific line from the file. If we split the line, we're going to get back a list of strings from that line. We then can take the second item. Well, let's just get the date, for example. Now, really, I'm not taking my own advice here. We really ought to be running these things as we go. So I'm going to suggest, we should be running them and also testing them. So I'm going to suggest that we test everything as we go, and I highly recommend that you do the same. I can begin by, I guess I'm going to use Paiku for this. I can begin by looking at each line and seeing what's in each line. And if I see what I'm expecting, then I know I'm on the right track. We're out of Gouda. This parrot has ceased to be. Spam, 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 spam. I wonder if you know why there's a blank line there. You might want to pause the video and think about it. The blank line is there because of the new line character. Print always drops us down a line. And the new line character will drop us down a further line. So I'm going to go ahead and do what we know we can do in order to fix that and do rstrip on it. And when I save this and run it, as long as I save it, oh, and I'm printing the result of the strip, I'll see that the new lines have been taken out. Now I'd like to split. Now I'm taking my advice that I've given to you for doing your homeworks. You have to test every line. If you get really lazy and you don't test every line, you're going to end up getting into trouble, even if it seems to work initially. Now, when I run this program now, what I've done is, oh, I'm running the wrong one, I think. And I'd like to do that with a clear in front of it. When I look at each line separately in items, you can see what I've got as a list. Why do I have a list? Because I'm printing items, and items came back from splits. Now you know split is going to return a list of strings, and that's from the line. So when we split that line and we see a list of strings, we know that we've successfully split each line into a list of strings. Why am I seeing 3 lists when I'm only printing items once? Well, don't forget, inside the for loop, we're going to iterate over those lines multiple times. And that means that if there are 3 lines in the file, we're going to execute lines 6, 7, and 8 3 times. And we're going to see 3 print statements. Now we've got each item. Let's just say we'd like to get the first word in each item. Now we hopefully should see, if we print it, the first word on each line. As long as we save it. Still no, oh, I see. It is working. I'm going to take out this print statement. And we see we're, this, and spam, which are the first words from each line. Why do we get the first words? Because item 0 gets us the first item. The first item from the list. The first item from the list. And that, because we did a split. And by the way, I haven't mentioned this before, and I didn't put it in the video, but you can see that I'm splitting on nothing. Now, if you look at the feature summary, you'll see that splitting on nothing, or if we use the value none, will split the string on a white space, meaning that we're going to get each word. And we saw that before when we printed each line as a list. You could see that each word was separate and that the spaces have been removed. When you split on white space, that is split without an argument, as you can see on line 7, it will split on the white space and remove the white space. So now that we've got each word, I've given you about as much hint as I need to get you to complete the homework. We've managed to use for looping to get each line as a string. We've stripped the string, so we got a string without the new line at the end. We then split the string into a list of strings and isolated the first word in each line. The last thing I might show you is how we might summarize this data. And you're going to do something very similar in the homework. If I was to set a line count to 0, and if at the end the end of the block, I were to add 1 to each, what value would I see if I printed line count at the very end? Now consider this carefully. You might want to pause the video until you hear before you listen to my explanation. Consider carefully that the for loop executes once for every line in the file. That means that lines 6, 7, 8, and 9 will execute once for every line in the file. So if there are 3 lines in the file, which there are in this case, we're going to see this execution. 6, 7, 8, 9, 6, 7, 8, 9, 6, 7, 8, 9, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now look at line 9. We're executing line 3 times. I guess I said that 4 times, so it's really 3 times. We're executing line 9 3 times. Line count equals line count plus 1. You can see what that does, right? We call that incrementing. When you say line count equals line count plus 1, we're taking the value of line count, which initially is 0. We're adding 1 to that 0 to get back 1, and we're assigning that 1 back to line count. The next time we loop through, which is of course what happens for the second line of the file, we're now on line 9. We're taking the value of line count, which is currently 1. We're adding 1 to it to make 2, and we're assigning that 2 back to line count. Again, it's called incrementing. It means adding 1 to it. So what are we going to see at the end for line count if the file has 3 lines? You might want to pause the video to see if you can figure it out. The answer is we're going to see 3 because for each line in the file, we added 1 to the line count value. And at the end, we only went through it 3 times. So line 9 was executed 3 times. And as you can see, line 9 increments the value. So the first time around, line count went from 0 to 1. Second time from 1 to 2. Third time from 2 to 3. And then finally, that was the last line of the file, and we didn't iterate anymore. Finally jumped down to line 10 and printed the line count. So this is what we call the summary algorithm. And you're going to do something similar in your homework. Instead of just counting the lines, you'll also be summing up one column of values. So if you look again at the values that we'll be looking at, you're going to be working with a file that's very similar to this. If I asked you to sum up the first column, just consider that you're going to go through the same process of looping through each line, splitting on a delimiter, and isolating the one value that you want to look at. That value is going to be a string. Let's say 0.09. Let's say you wanted to loop through this file and isolate each float so you could sum them up. Well, let's look at the similarity here with this program. This program is looping through the file line by line, which is definitely what we want. Each line is a string. We're stripping the string just for cleanliness, although we don't really need to. We're going to do it anyway. And, I guess I should have said rline.split, shouldn't I? This just shows how unnecessary the rstrip was, but, it's good form anyway. We then split that line into a list of strings and then isolated the first item from the list. But what if we were to isolate the second item from the list? What we would get back is not a word from the Paiku file, but rather a value from the FamaFrench data file. This value will be a string, but you can convert it to a float. And if you convert it to a float, you could use it to compile a sum of values from the file as you go line by line. And this sum would be constructed in the very same way we did counting. As you can see, we used a counter to count how many times the for loop looped. And of course, we know that means how many times did the for loop over a file. Thus, we're able to very easily count the number of lines that we've encountered when we loop through the file. In the same way, you're going to build a sum. But instead of adding 1 to the sum value, you're going to add 0.09, then 0.44, then 0.97, etc. in order to produce a sum for a given column in a file. So that's the tabular data summary algorithm. I hope it was clear. I can certainly answer questions about it, and you'll be doing your homework on it. I believe it's the first homework in session 3.